Hey guys, it's MoFi. My 3 demo songs in level 1 are completely done and the last thing I have to do is copyright my songs. I'm also currently looking at venues to perform my music for when they come out. In the meantime, I wanted to share a story with you guys. It's about one of my favorite tracks I've ever produced, and in the end, I think you guys will love how it turns out. Before I start my story, I must say that this video might be a bit controversial. Some of the topics are really heavy. Nevertheless, I'll still remain true to the end goal, which is to entertain you guys and hopefully you guys learn something new. Now, you might not know this about me, but I'm actually a big D&D fan. It's actually ironic because there was a time when I thought that would be the last thing I would ever do. Turns out, it's one of my favorite games ever. I even prefer to play it over video games sometimes. If you guys aren't familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, it's a role-playing game that usually takes place in a medieval setting. It has magical beasts, spells, and equipment. The game requires you to make an original character with their own original spells, background traits, principles, abilities, and proficiencies. You then must work together with your friends, who have also made their original characters, to defeat monsters, save a village, find a secret treasure, and things of that nature. There's a guy known as a Dungeon Master who creates the story and chooses the monsters that you guys fight. Now, I know what you guys might be thinking, that is the nerdiest thing I've ever heard of. Believe me, I thought the same, until I tried it out myself. The game requires strategy, promotes teamwork, and creativity to save the day. Every time you play, the story is different, which makes for endless fun. My friend is usually the dungeon master of my friend group. Recently wanted to start a new campaign, so we had to make our new characters. When making new characters in D&D, you must decide from one of the 13 classes. The class basically decides how you fight. For example, a barbarian is a melee combatant. His main thing is raging, which doubles his damage. Another example is a wizard. The wizard has the most diverse spell list in all of the game. Being the music guy that I am, I decided to go with the bard. The bard is a patron of the arts who uses his creative talents to cast spells. This is done through music. At the same time that writing this new campaign, I was also learning about African culture, specifically West Africa. My father is from Mali, and I wanted to get in touch with my roots, so I started researching about the country. While I was researching, I found out so many cool things. For example, the Malian Empire ruled for 1,000 years, between 13th and 14th century. I also found out about the Mandinka saber. It was basically like the African equivalent to a katana. The thing that really caught my interest though was the Jali. The Jali is a highly trained historian, storyteller, praise singer, poet, and musician who delivers history lessons about his country and his people through song. The Jali was a respectable part of the village, and it was up to the people to protect him. If the Jali were to die, then so does some of the history of the village, unless the Jali passes some of his knowledge to his descendants. My father told me that if I ever went back to Mali, I could find a Jali and he could tell me about my ancestors. I thought that was so cool. The Jali is like a mix between School Rock and Ancestry.com. I was so fascinated with the idea of an oral historian that I decided I would make that for my D&D character. I thought it would be super cool to make a traditional African song to go with my character. That is the point when I received my challenge. I thought very little about African culture. There was nothing about it that caught his interest. Therefore, he challenged me to create traditional African music that he could enjoy. It didn't have to be his favorite genre or anything. It just had to be globally acceptable. Wayne is one of my best friends. He's very clever, competitive, confident, and very skillful in what he's good at, specifically video games, book publishing, and screenwriting. Me and Wayne can hold a debate for long periods of time, and are able to understand the other person's point of view, which leaves every conversation feeling worthwhile. Even if we aren't able to see eye to eye, we can understand the other person's perspective. Unfortunately, there's one topic that we have never been able to agree with. It's something that I've been trying to change for some time now. That argument is whether Africa, and specifically its inhabitants, previously or currently possess any distinctive value in their culture, social structure, language, and or history that makes it deserving of respect when compared to the status of other nations. Basically, Africa has no unique cultural features that makes it worthy of respect. Everything special about it came out of a bottle. It was not invented by the people of Africa, but simply given from another nation. Also, nearly anything that would have been deemed plausible is now irrelevant or otherwise seen as outdated technology. He believes there's nothing inherently great about African people, and who could blame him? He hasn't been exposed to African culture that gives it reputable attributes, and when would he ever get the chance? Definitely not in America. We grew up during a time when it was common to make fun of Africa's misfortunes. Tropes like starving children, rampant diseases, half-naked people, water-scarce lands, and a place full of a majority who are too stupid to know how to keep up with the times technologically are all too common living in America. We are only left with what we are told, and what we are told about Africa is usually nothing but negativity. Now, that's not to say that most of those terrible things aren't true in specific parts of Africa, but I know for a fact that it is a lot more than just that. The richest man on earth, Mansa Musa, came from West Africa. He was the ruler of the Malian Empire for 25 years. The oldest university is in Africa, specifically Morocco. I personally know how beautiful Africa is, but it pains me to know that others do not, especially since I'm a descendant from there. That's why, when Wayne challenged me, I made sure to give it my all. So here's what I gotta do. He wants me to be able to make a medieval African song that would be globally acceptable. Although he knows I'm very proficient at making great music, that's not what this challenge is about. He's not questioning my skills, but rather the skills of Africans. Therefore, he set up some ground rules. Rule number 1, at least half of the instruments need to originate from Africa. Instruments that originate from another country but were created in Africa do not count. This first rule challenges the notion of culture and whether Africans were able to create instruments worthy of merit. I'm going to try my best to stay away from flutes and horns unless they are very distinct to Africa, and it's obvious that the instruments originate from the continent. Rule 2. The music has to be inspired by African music theory and structure. This means that it cannot be medieval music inspired by the Western world, played with African instruments. The music itself needs to sound like African medieval music. This rule challenges the notion of whether Africans were capable of making good traditional music that could be suitable to anyone outside of Africa. This rule came to fruition after I previously showed Wayne the mbira, an instrument that is featured in Avatar: The Last Airbender but originates in Africa, specifically Zimbabwe. Rule 3. The music must be played by African musicians. This means that even if there were African instruments with African music theory, it must be played by Africans. Despite these rules, I found them super fun and allowed me to learn more about the continent from a musical standpoint. But then it hit me. The problem with all these rules is that it is basically telling me that I must know an African band with African instruments. Not to mention the fact that I rarely like to collaborate with other artists in the first place. Sometimes you don't know how skilled they are, or they just take too long. Your priorities are not their priorities. It was starting to look like this challenge was over before it even began. On top of how unlikely it is for me to get a band together, the rules are low-key disrespectful. At first I couldn't believe it. Out of context, these rules can make anyone angry, especially if they were from Africa. But I can't be mad at someone's ignorance. They simply don't know, and this gives me insight into how rooted certain ways of thinking and specifically discrimination can be. If anything, this is a golden opportunity to enlighten someone. But that still begs the question, where am I going to find African musicians? I was thinking about this while listening to African music on the internet, and that's when it hit me. I'll just use the internet. I can sample African music from there to create something new. I wasn't certain if I had all the know-how, but I used Njabis for inspiration. Here was the plan. Firstly, I need to research original instruments from Africa and compile a list of all the instruments I want to use. I'm going to take most of my inspiration from West Africa because that's where the Jali is from, and it's also the region that I'm most familiar with. Second, I need to find live performances, specifically solo pieces to sample. The more a cappella, the more freedom I have to mess with the sample. Next, I need to take my samples and make them sound good with one another. This can be a little bit tricky, specifically when dealing with chords, but I'm pretty sure that I can manage. Lastly, I need to rearrange them. Honestly, I can't wait for this part. By then, it's just smooth sailing. With all that being said, it was time to get started. I compiled a list of African instruments by searching on the web and asking my dad about any that he was familiar with. I wanted to have a good mix of rhythmic and melodic instruments. I definitely wanted to stay away from harmonics. African music isn't necessarily known for their chords. They are best known for their unique polyrhythms and repeating melodies. These repeating melodies are known as motifs. If you guys are confused on the difference between a motif and a melody, just think about Roddy Ricch the Bucks. After doing a lot of research, I decided to go with the bolophon, Ngoni, shakir, dondo, aka the talking drum, djembe, mbira, and kora. I decided to use a few medieval Western instruments to still keep that D&D feel. The Western instruments include the sham, saturn, flute, and dulcimer. Once I compiled the list of instruments that I wanted to use, it was time for me to find my samples. Before I had started this challenge, I had showed what bolophon sounds like, since he had no idea what it was. I should have expected him to see it as an inferior instrument, but honestly, I was still surprised. He said something on the lines of, this instrument was improved upon by Europeans creating the xylophone. Anyways, I stumbled upon a YouTube video of two bolophon musicians playing a traditional rhythm known as samawada. The two bolophon players were Yusuf Kita and Kasim Kita. I really enjoyed their tune and decided to make it the main motif that would repeat through my track. Afterwards, I looked for a great kora player. To my surprise, it was a lot harder to find a solo piece of a kora player, but I found a duo of two kora players that I was quite familiar with. Their names were Tumani Jabiti and Sidiki Jabiti. The original song was known as Jarabi. Finding some good djembe recordings wasn't hard at all. It's actually a very popular instrument of West Africa. It really came down to which one I wanted to use. I found out about this djembe rhythm known as kuku, and I decided to use that performance. There was also this ensemble of djembe players on a metro of Paris. I decided to sample that as well. Next was finding a great Ngoni player. I actually found many online, but few were able to be sampled to my liking. Fortunately, I came across this live performance by a well-known Jali known as Sheikh Hamala Jabiti. The performance was about an hour long, so it took me a long time to find the right part, but eventually I came across it. By now, you may have noticed that a lot of these performers have the same last name. This is because the occupation of Jali runs in the family. If your father was a Jali, you are also going to be a Jali. The last African instrument that I had to find was the mbira. I found a demonstration from the YouTube channel How To, played by Hassan Bakir. Unfortunately, the instrument wasn't tuned to the Western scale, so it would have sounded out of pitch. I decided to listen to the track and transpose it into Logic. Afterwards, I bounced it into a WAV file, and then I transported it to FL Studios. The Western instruments were very easy to find, and there wasn't much difficulty. Everyone has heard of a flute, shawm, dulcimer, and sauterne, so finding samples was a piece of cake. The dulcimer was a bit more difficult, but all worked out in the end. I brought all my samples over to FL, and then it was time to start working. I used the balafon as a basis for the entire project. I looped it so it was constantly repeating every bar. It was in the key of F sharp minor, but to be honest, I wasn't necessarily listening for that at first. I just kept the motif in the back of my head while playing another sample to see if it would fit. Ironically, the sauterne melody that I heard earlier was also in the key of F sharp minor. It almost felt too good to be true, but it all worked out. I was off to an amazing start. I just had to make sure that everything looped perfectly. At the time of recording this script, I listened back on Samawara, the balafon players, and realized that it could have worked in both minor and major key of F sharp. This is because the notes that would have defined whether the music was in a minor or major key were never played. This means that the balafon follows the pentatonic scale, a scale of only 5 notes. I know a lot of you guys might not know what that actually means, but basically, it makes my job 10 times easier. After I looped the balafon, I cut out the low end and added a limiter. Originally, I had also cut out the high end to try and mute the kid who was talking in the background, but he started to grow on me, so I kept him in the mix. The next instrument I decided to work with was the sauterne. Afterwards, I realized how important some bass would be. Without it, the music would go nowhere, no matter how many instruments I added. I took the first part of the sauterne melody and looped it. Afterwards, I added some reverb, a limiter, and cut out the high end of all the people talking. If I took out too much high end, the sauterne would have sounded muffled. I left some in despite the background sounds. The dulcimer was played with low notes, so I cut out as much high end as possible and used that as bass as well. I cut the sample and rearranged the notes so that it followed the progression of the sauterne. Some of the higher notes could still be heard though, creating spicy chords that I would have never thought of. At one point, the bass note of the sauterne and the dulcimer played different notes at the same time. Throughout the song, the mbira, sauterne, and dulcimer function as some type of bass. It was integral that at least one of these instruments were played throughout the track, otherwise there will be no music progression. The flute melody definitely had its time to shine, accompanied by the Ngoni. All I really had to do was match the flute to the tempo and bring the pitch down by a whole step so that it was on the key of F sharp minor. I didn't have to do much mixing since the original recording was already professionally done. Now the last instrument was a nuisance. Although the recording was good, it did not match the key of F sharp minor in the slightest. It was in a major key when I was working in a minor key. It was nowhere near the close tempo, and also the pitch was off. There was a lot of stretching, cutting, and pitch correcting before I finally got it right, but it all worked out in the end. I knew that adding the shawm would be worth it in the end, so I kept it. Despite all these changes, I made sure to stay true to the original rhythm. Afterwards, I had everything done. I arranged them to my liking, making sure everything fit perfectly, and nothing felt left out. I wanted to make sure that each instrument was a valuable component and the song would feel lackluster without it. Now without further ado, I give you guys Jolly Tunes. When he heard Jolly Tunes, he was truly astonished. There was a slight mixing problem with the drums at first that made him think that he had won, but I quickly fixed it later on and he swallowed his words. He would have never imagined that he would find African music appealing to his ears, but here he was, listening to it. My only complaint was the fact that he called it a tune that he could imagine in a jungle movie. Unfortunately, that's a social construct that he has been taught, and one that I have no control over. Only Wayne has the power to change the way he views something when given new information about it, but I know a hard time swallowing his pride. I know this because I do as well. At the end of the day, this is a result of years of indoctrination to believe that African music would sound as though it belongs in a jungle movie. Africa is an amazing place, and it should never be seen as less. The people have such a rich history that is worth the utmost respect. The richest man to ever live, Mansa Musa, came from Africa. The Institute of Timbuktu had 20,000 manuscripts. Africa had countless empires, including the Songhai, Malian, and Kingdom of Kush. They were one of the first to create constitutions dating back to 1235. They had honor for nature, people, and even their own slaves. That's right, they had slaves, but even their slaves had rights, and were not treated worse than animals. Africa was, and still can be, a beautiful place, despite countless intermissions from outside forces. I hope this video leads you down a rabbit hole to find out more. This project was super fun. I not only learned a lot about sampling and West African culture, but also how certain beliefs can be embedded into our thinking, whether they be right or wrong. I have some eccentric ways of thinking, but I know that it's not his fault. Therefore, I never get mad at him. Instead, I always take it as an opportunity to challenge his original way of thinking and hopefully educate him on something he didn't know about before. He also does the same for me because that's what friends do. If you want to learn more about African culture, I recommend checking out Home Team History, From Nothing, Epimetheus, or Ali Bai. Links are in the description below. I hope you guys enjoyed Jolly Tunes, and I hope you guys learned something new about African music, sampling techniques, or even how discrimination works to a certain extent. Jolly Tunes is definitely a track that I admire a lot for its complexity. I had never been challenged on such a technical level before. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I appreciate you guys for watching.